On March 17th, 1850, the city of Charleston witnessed something that should have been impossible. Ryan's Mart, the largest slave auction house south of Richmond, sold a young man for a price so astronomical that it broke every record in South Carolina's history. The final bid was $12,400. To put that in perspective, a skilled blacksmith sold for $800. A trained house servant might fetch $1,200. Even the most valuable cotton pickers rarely exceeded $1,500. But this young man, barely 21 years old, sold for more than 8 times that amount. The Charleston Mercury reported the sale with unusual restraint, mentioning only that a domestic servant of extraordinary qualities had been purchased by a prominent family. They didn't print his name. They didn't describe him. They certainly didn't mention the secret that made his sale not just extraordinary, but legally impossible. Because 7 people in that auction room knew something the others didn't. They knew that the young man standing on that platform, being examined like livestock, being bid on like property, couldn't legally be sold. Not because of any technicality or paperwork error, but because of who he actually was. Within 6 months, 3 of those 7 witnesses would be dead. 2 would flee Charleston and never return. The remaining 2 would take an oath of silence that they maintained until their own deaths decades later. The auction records were sealed by court order in 1851. They have never been opened. The family who purchased him for that astronomical sum was destroyed within a year, their name erased from Charleston's social registry, their mansion sold at auction, their descendants scattered. And the young man himself? He vanished, not gradually, not quietly, but completely, as if he had never existed at all. Until now, no one has asked the most obvious question. If this young man was so valuable, so extraordinary, so desired by Charleston's wealthiest families, why did someone go to such lengths to erase every trace of him? The answer begins not with the auction, but with a letter that arrived in Charleston 6 weeks earlier, a letter that should have stayed buried forever. Before we go further into what happened at Ryan's Mart on that March morning, I need to know something. If you're watching from South Carolina, Georgia, or anywhere along the Carolina coast, leave a comment with your state. Because what happened in Charleston in 1850 sent ripples through every plantation, every wealthy family, every carefully constructed social hierarchy, from Savannah to Wilmington. And if your ancestors lived in the South during that time, this story might have touched them in ways they never spoke about. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about the secrets they buried, the truths they sealed away, the people they tried to erase, hit subscribe right now. Because what you're about to hear is just the beginning. The letter arrived at Ashwood Hall on February 1st, 1850. It came by private courier from Savannah, marked urgent, addressed to Colonel Marcus Ashwood in handwriting so shaky it was barely legible. Ashwood Hall was one of Charleston's grandest estates. 300 acres of rice fields stretching down to the Ashley River, a mansion that had taken 4 years to build, imported marble from Italy, chandeliers from France, furniture that had belonged to minor European nobility. The Ashwood family had been in Carolina since 1690. They had signed documents, they had fought in wars, they were, as they would tell you without prompting, the embodiment of Southern aristocracy. Colonel Marcus Ashwood, age 52, was a man who understood power. He had inherited Ashwood Hall from his father, expanded it, made it more profitable, more prestigious. He owned 143 enslaved people. He served on the boards of 3 banks. He had been offered the governorship twice and declined both times, preferring the power that came from staying in the shadows. He was also, by all accounts, a man of rigid principles. He attended Episcopal services every Sunday. He paid his debts promptly. He treated his slaves, as he would say, with appropriate Christian discipline. He believed absolutely in the natural order of things, in hierarchy, in the proper arrangement of society. The letter he opened that February morning challenged every principle he held. It was from his younger brother, Robert. Robert Ashwood had always been the difficult one, the charming one, the one who couldn't quite settle into the responsibilities expected of him. While Marcus learned plantation management and cultivated political connections, Robert learned poetry, philosophy, and the art of disappointing everyone who cared about him. When their father died in 1825, he left everything to Marcus. Robert received a generous allowance with one condition, that he never embarrass the family name. Robert, then 22, took the money and left for Europe within the month. For 16 years, Marcus received occasional letters from Paris, Rome, London, cheerful descriptions of museums and theatres and intellectual salons. Marcus sent money when requested and considered it a fair price for Robert's absence. Then, in 1841, the letters stopped. For 9 years, Marcus heard nothing. He assumed Robert had died in some European city, probably in debt, probably alone. He didn't investigate. The allowance continued to be paid into a London bank account. As long as it was being withdrawn, Robert was presumably alive. That was enough. But the letter that arrived in February 1850 was different. The handwriting was Robert's, but transformed. What had once been flowing and elegant was now cramped and shaking. The paper was cheap. The seal was wax, but common wax, not the quality a gentleman would use. Marcus read it standing in his study, the morning sun coming through windows that overlooked his rice fields. Marcus, I am dying. Consumption, the doctors say. 6 months at most. I am writing from Savannah, having returned to America because I had nowhere else to go. I need to tell you something I should have told you years ago. In 1842, I married. Her name was Catherine. She was from Charleston originally. We met in Paris, where she was working as a governess for an American family. We married in London and lived there for 7 years. Catherine died last year of fever. But before she died, we had a son. His name is Daniel. He is 21 years old. He has never been to America. He speaks English with a British accent. He has been educated at good schools. He reads Latin and Greek. He plays piano. He has absolutely no practical skills whatsoever, and I fear he would be hopeless at anything requiring physical labor. Marcus, Catherine was our cousin. Her maiden name was Catherine Ashwood. She was Uncle Thomas's daughter. Marcus stopped reading. His hands, usually so steady, began to shake. Uncle Thomas had been his father's younger brother. Thomas Ashwood had moved to Charleston in 1815, made a modest fortune in shipping, married a local woman named Sarah, and died in 1825, the same year as Marcus's father. Thomas's wife Sarah had died 2 years later of fever. They had one daughter, Catherine, born in 1820, and Catherine had been classified by South Carolina law as colored, not obviously. Sarah, her mother, had been what Charleston called high yellow, light enough to pass in certain contexts, but undeniably of African descent. Catherine had inherited her mother's coloring, her features. She could pass for Mediterranean, perhaps Spanish or Italian, but not for purely white. When Thomas died, his will had freed Catherine and provided a small trust for her education. She'd left Charleston at 16, gone north, then apparently to Europe. Marcus hadn't thought about her in 20 years. But if Robert had married her, if they'd had a son, Marcus forced himself to keep reading. Daniel knows nothing of his mother's background. In Europe, it didn't matter. He was simply Daniel Ashwood, son of an English gentleman of modest means. But I know what it means here. I know what South Carolina law says about inheritance of status. I am asking you for help, not for me. I'll be dead soon, and I've made my peace with that. But for Daniel, he has no one else. His mother is dead. I will be dead. He's alone in a country he's never lived in, with no money, no connections, no understanding of how different things are here. I'm asking you to take him in. Not as family, I understand that's impossible given his mother's background, but as something. A secretary, perhaps. You always needed someone who could handle European correspondence. He's brilliant with languages and numbers. He would be useful to you. He's your nephew, Marcus. He's Ashwood blood, whatever the law says about the rest. I'm begging you, Robert." Marcus read the letter 3 times. Then he walked to the window and looked out at his fields, his perfectly ordered world, and felt something shift beneath him. His first impulse was to refuse, to write back and say that Robert's choices were his own problem, that Marcus had no obligation to a nephew he'd never met, especially one whose legal status was so catastrophically complicated. But Marcus was also a practical man, and as he stood there, an idea began forming. An idea that, had he examined it more closely, should have horrified him. Instead, it felt like opportunity. He sat down and wrote a reply. Brief, formal, but not unkind. Robert should bring Daniel to Charleston. Marcus would meet them at Ashwood Hall and determine appropriate arrangements. The young man should bring any documentation he possessed regarding his birth and education. Marcus signed it, sealed it, sent it express to Savannah. Then he sat in his study for a long time, thinking about value and bloodlines and the strange mathematics of Southern law. Daniel Ashwood arrived at Ashwood Hall on February 24th, 1850. It was a Thursday, unseasonably cold for Charleston, with a wind coming off the river that cut through even heavy coats. Marcus was waiting on the front portico when the carriage arrived. He'd sent it to collect Daniel from the boarding house in Savannah, where Robert had died 3 days earlier. Robert hadn't lived long enough to make the journey to Charleston. He'd passed in his sleep, peacefully, according to the boarding house owner, with Daniel sitting beside him. The carriage door opened, and Daniel Ashwood stepped out. Marcus felt his breath catch. The young man who stood before him was, without qualification, the most physically beautiful human being Marcus had ever seen. Not handsome in a conventional way, but beautiful in the way a sculpture is beautiful, in the way something perfectly proportioned and ideally formed is beautiful. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with a slender but well-proportioned build. His hair was dark, almost black, with a slight wave that caught the afternoon light. His eyes were an unusual shade, neither quite brown nor quite green, but something in between, amber-colored with flecks of gold. His features were absolutely symmetrical, with high cheekbones, a straight nose, and a mouth that seemed designed for portraits. His skin was the color of old ivory, pale but with a warmth to it that suggested something other than pure English ancestry. In London, he would have passed for Italian. In Charleston, anyone who looked carefully would see his mother's heritage in the texture of his hair, in the shape of his mouth, in something indefinable about his features. But the overall effect was striking. This was someone people would stare at, would remember, would talk about. Daniel descended from the carriage, carrying a single leather case. He wore a black suit, well-tailored but showing signs of wear, appropriate for mourning. His posture was excellent, his movements graceful. Everything about him suggested education and breeding. When he reached Marcus, he extended his hand. His voice, when he spoke, was cultured, with a distinct British accent. "Colonel Ashwood, I'm Daniel. Thank you for receiving me. I know this must be complicated." Marcus didn't take his hand. He was too busy calculating. Daniel looked white. More than white, he looked aristocratic. But his mother had been legally colored. Under South Carolina law, that made Daniel colored as well, regardless of his appearance or where he'd been born. Which meant Daniel, standing here in his expensive mourning clothes, speaking in his refined British accent, could legally be enslaved. The thought formed slowly, carefully, like ice crystallizing. If Daniel was colored by law, and if Marcus could establish ownership, then Daniel wasn't a nephew at all. He was property. Extraordinarily valuable property. "Come inside," Marcus said finally, his voice neutral. "We need to discuss your situation." Marcus led Daniel through the grand entrance hall of Ashwood Hall, past portraits of ancestors who had built this empire, through corridors lined with mahogany and silk, into his private study. The room was designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a massive desk made from Carolina black walnut, Windows overlooking the rice fields where 143 people worked in bondage. Daniel stood in the center of the room, still holding his leather case, waiting. "Sit," Marcus said, gesturing to a chair positioned deliberately lower than his own desk chair. Daniel sat. His posture remained perfect, his expression polite but guarded. He understood something was wrong, he just didn't yet understand what. "You have documentation?" Marcus asked. "Birth certificate? Baptismal records? Anything proving your identity?" "Yes, sir." Daniel opened his case and withdrew a leather portfolio. Inside were several documents, all carefully preserved. A birth certificate from London, 1829, listing his parents as Robert Ashwood and Catherine Ashwood, née Ashwood. A baptismal record from Street Martin in the Fields. School certificates from 2 London academies. Letters of reference from 3 tutors. Marcus examined each document slowly, making notes in a small book. When he finished, he placed them on his desk. He didn't return them to Daniel. "These appear authentic," he said carefully. "I'll keep them here for safekeeping." Daniel's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. "I'd prefer to keep them with me, if you don't mind." "I do mind," Marcus said, his voice still pleasant. "You're a guest in my home. Your documents are safer in my desk than in whatever room you'll be staying in." It wasn't a request. Daniel, with no money and nowhere else to go, simply nodded. Marcus leaned back in his chair. "Daniel, I need you to understand something about your situation. Your father was my brother, and I promised him I would help you. But your mother's background creates certain legal complications." "My mother was your cousin," Daniel said quietly. "My father told me before he died. He said it might matter here in ways it didn't matter in England." "Your mother was colored," Marcus said bluntly. "Under South Carolina law, that classification passes to children, which means, legally speaking, you are colored as well." Daniel went very still. "I was born in London. I'm a British subject." "You're in South Carolina now," Marcus replied. "British law doesn't apply here. South Carolina law does. And South Carolina law is very clear about status inheritance." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that your legal status here is ambiguous. You appear white. You were educated as white. But by blood and by law, you are colored. Without my protection, you would be vulnerable. There are men in Charleston who make their living challenging the status of people who look like you. They investigate, they find proof of colored ancestry, and they claim legal ownership. It's a profitable business." This was partially true. Such men did exist, but Marcus was exaggerating the danger, and he knew it. "So what do you propose?" Daniel asked, his voice carefully controlled. "I'm willing to offer you protection," Marcus said. "You can stay here at Ashwood Hall. You'll work as my private secretary. You clearly have the education for it. You'll handle my business correspondence, particularly anything involving European contacts. In exchange, you'll have food, shelter, and safety." "As what?" Daniel asked. "As your nephew? As an employee?" Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. "As my property." The silence that followed was absolute. Daniel's face, which had remained composed through everything, went blank with shock. "You want me to pretend to be enslaved?" "Not pretend," Marcus said gently, as if explaining something to a child. "Under South Carolina law, given your mother's status, you can be legally enslaved. I'm offering to do so under controlled circumstances, with the understanding that you'll be treated well and given appropriate work. It's the safest arrangement for everyone." "Safe," Daniel repeated, the word hollow. "Think about your alternatives," Marcus continued. "You have no money. You know no one in America except me. You speak English with a British accent that makes you conspicuous. Your appearance will invite questions you can't adequately answer. Where would you go? What would you do? How long before someone decided to investigate your background and found what I found? You could simply help me," Daniel said, his voice shaking slightly. "You could give me money to travel north. You could write letters of introduction to families in Boston or New York. You could act like the uncle my father believed you to be." "I could," Marcus agreed, but I won't, because that would leave loose ends. You wandering around America, telling people you're an Ashwood, potentially creating complications for my family. This way, everything is clean. You exist in my records, your presence is explained, and you're under my direct control. Daniel stood up slowly. And if I refuse? Then I cannot help you, Marcus said. I'll return your documents and provide you with enough money to reach Charleston proper. After that, you're on your own. A young man with a British accent, no connections, no money, and a complicated racial heritage in a city that doesn't look kindly on ambiguity. Daniel looked at his uncle for a long moment. He was understanding, perhaps for the first time in his life, what powerlessness actually meant. In London, he'd been protected by British law, by his father's name, by the simple fact that racial classifications worked differently there. Here, he was discovering that law and protection could be withdrawn as easily as extending a hand and then pulling it back. "When do I start?" he asked finally, the words tasting like poison. "Tomorrow," Marcus said. "But first, we need to establish your status officially." He opened a ledger on his desk, the same ledger where he recorded all his property. Land, buildings, livestock, people. He began writing, speaking aloud as he did. Acquired February 24th, 1850. One male, age 21. Name, Daniel. No surname. Light-skinned, British educated, suitable for domestic work and secretarial duties. Private acquisition, no bill of sale required due to family circumstances. Value estimated at $2,800. He looked up at Daniel. "There. Now you exist in my records. Your presence here is explained. Your father's papers are safe in my desk. And you are, legally and officially, my property." Daniel said nothing. What was there to say? He just watched himself be transformed from a person into an entry in a ledger, from a nephew into property, with nothing more than a few strokes of a pen. "I'll have someone show you to your quarters," Marcus continued. "You'll stay in one of the servants' cabins behind the main house. They're quite comfortable. Tomorrow morning, you'll begin work in the small office adjacent to this study." "May I ask one question?" Daniel said quietly. "Of course. Did you ever intend to help me, or was this your plan from the moment you received my father's letter?" Marcus considered the question. In truth, he hadn't planned this exactly. But when he'd seen Daniel, seen how extraordinary he looked, seen the potential value, the plan had formed almost instantly. "I intended to do what was practical," he said finally, "for both of us." Daniel was taken to a cabin behind the main house. It was indeed comfortable by the standards of enslaved quarters. One room with a bed, a table, a chair, a small fireplace. Better than the fieldworkers' cabins, but unmistakably separate from the main house. That night, Daniel unpacked his few possessions, the books he'd brought from London, his father's letters tied with string, a miniature portrait of his mother, painted when she was young, before she'd left Charleston. He stared at that portrait for a long time. Catherine Ashwood had been beautiful, with warm brown skin and gentle eyes. In the portrait, she wore a simple but elegant dress. She looked happy. Daniel wondered if she'd ever told his father the truth about what leaving Charleston had meant for her. If she'd explained that she wasn't just seeking adventure in Europe, but escaping a place where her very existence was considered problematic. He wondered if his father had truly understood what he was asking when he'd begged Marcus to take Daniel in. He wondered if he would survive this. For 4 weeks, the arrangement functioned exactly as Marcus had designed it. Daniel worked as Marcus's secretary, handling correspondence with European merchants, translating documents from French and Italian, maintaining sensitive financial records. He was brilliant at the work, which shouldn't have surprised anyone who looked at his education, but somehow did. Marcus found himself consulting Daniel on matters beyond simple translation: investment strategies, contract negotiations, political developments in Europe that might affect American markets. Daniel answered carefully, precisely, demonstrating abilities far beyond what his official status should have included. The other enslaved people at Ashwood Hall didn't know what to make of him. He looked white, but lived in the cabins. He spoke like a British gentleman, but worked as a slave. He existed in a category that made no sense. A few were kind to him. Sarah, who ran the main house kitchen. Thomas, an older man who maintained the gardens. They brought him extra food, warned him when Marcus was in a particularly harsh mood, taught him the unspoken rules of plantation life. Others avoided him entirely, suspicious of anyone who occupied such a strange position. Daniel accepted the kindness when it was offered, but kept mostly to himself. He spent his evenings in his cabin, reading by candlelight, writing letters he never sent. But Marcus had made a critical miscalculation. He'd assumed that Daniel's extraordinary appearance would remain a private asset, something he could utilize quietly within the plantation's boundaries. He'd planned to keep Daniel at Ashwood Hall indefinitely, a secret secretary whose value lay in his abilities and his complete dependence. He hadn't anticipated what would happen when he brought Daniel to Charleston. The trip occurred on March 13th, 3 weeks after Daniel's arrival. Marcus needed to attend several business meetings in the city. Banking matters, shipping contracts, the kind of high-level negotiations that required both sophistication and discretion. On impulse, he decided to bring Daniel along. The young man could take notes, translate if necessary, and demonstrate Marcus's cosmopolitan connections. "Look, I have a secretary who speaks 4 languages and reads Latin." They traveled by carriage. Arriving in Charleston at midday, the city was crowded with merchants and sailors and enslaved people running errands for their owners. The smell of salt water mixed with horses and cooking food and human sweat. Marcus had 3 meetings scheduled, one at the Charleston Bank, one at a cotton merchant's office, one at the home of a shipping magnate named Whitmore. Daniel accompanied him to all 3, standing quietly in corners, taking notes when requested, occasionally translating a phrase from French or Italian. And everywhere they went, people stared. Not rudely, exactly, but unmistakably. Women found reasons to walk past where Daniel stood. Men studied him with calculating expressions. Conversations would pause when he entered a room, not because he'd done anything, but because his presence was simply that arresting. At the 3rd meeting, held in Whitmore's elegant townhouse, something shifted. Margaret Whitmore, the host's wife, was a woman of about 45, with sharp intelligence and sharper social instincts. During a pause in her husband's conversation with Marcus, she approached and spoke in a low voice. "Colonel Ashwood, forgive my directness, but I must ask. That young man who accompanies you, he is your property?" Marcus, who had been expecting this question all day, nodded. "A recent acquisition. He serves as my secretary." "He's remarkable," she said bluntly. "I've never seen anyone quite like him. Where did you acquire him?" "A private arrangement," Marcus said vaguely. "Family circumstances." "Would you consider offers?" Another woman interjected. This was Eleanor Hayes, a wealthy widow who owned 6 properties in Charleston and was known for maintaining an extensive household of light-skinned servants. "I would pay handsomely for someone of his qualities," she continued, "extremely handsomely." Marcus demurred, saying Daniel was too useful to part with, but the question lodged itself in his mind like a hook. All the way back to Ashwood Hall that evening, he thought about it. How much would someone pay for Daniel? Not just for his skills, but for the sheer spectacle of owning him. That night, after Daniel had returned to his cabin, Marcus sat in his study and did calculations. He'd recorded Daniel's value at $2,800, which was already high for a domestic servant. But based on today's reactions, he could sell Daniel for much more. Perhaps $4,000, perhaps $5,000, perhaps even more. The more he thought about it, the more sense it made. Daniel's presence at Ashwood Hall was becoming complicated. The young man was too distinctive, too memorable. Other enslaved people were uncomfortable around him. Visitors asked too many questions. Better to sell him publicly, in a venue where his extraordinary value would be obvious and documented, where the sale would be legal and unquestionable. Ryan's Mart conducted auctions every Saturday. They were professional, well-attended events. Selling Daniel there would be not just profitable, but prestigious. On March 14th, he began making arrangements. Daniel learned about the sale on March 15th, a Friday evening. He was in his cabin reading by candlelight when Marcus arrived with 2 overseers. The presence of 3 men told Daniel immediately that something had changed. "I've decided to sell you," Marcus said without preamble. "There's an auction at Ryan's Mart tomorrow. You'll be presented there." The book fell from Daniel's hands. "You gave me your word," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You said this arrangement was for my protection, that I would be safe here." "And you have been safe," Marcus replied smoothly. "But circumstances change. I've received inquiries from several prominent Charleston families. They're willing to pay extraordinary sums for someone of your qualities. You'll be far more comfortable in a city household than here. Access to culture, society, libraries. It's actually an improvement." "I'm not property to be sold," Daniel said, his voice shaking. "I'm your nephew. I'm your brother's son. I have documentation proving I was born free in London." "You have documentation that I'm safeguarding," Marcus corrected, "and you're forgetting that your situation is more complex than simple paperwork. Your mother's status determines your own. South Carolina law is very clear about this." "My mother was free," Daniel said desperately. "Your uncle freed her in his will. I can prove it." "Your mother was colored," Marcus said flatly. "Whatever your uncle's will said, that doesn't change what she was. And in South Carolina, that means you inherit her status. I'm actually protecting you by maintaining clear ownership. Otherwise, someone else could challenge your status and claim you. At least this way, you'll belong to a respectable family." It was the same twisted logic from before, but now sharpened into a weapon. "Please," Daniel said, and he hated how the word sounded, hated the desperation in his own voice. "Please don't do this. My father trusted you. He believed you would protect me." "And I have protected you," Marcus said. "I've given you shelter, food, appropriate work. But this arrangement has run its course. You're too distinctive, too memorable. People ask too many questions. It's time for you to move to a household where your qualities will be properly appreciated. By being sold like livestock. By being sold to people who will value you," Marcus said. "Now, you have 2 choices. You can cooperate with these arrangements, present yourself well tomorrow, and likely secure placement with a good family. Or you can resist, in which case you'll be restrained, transported by force, and presented in whatever condition we can manage. The choice is yours." Daniel looked at the 3 men standing in his small cabin. He understood that resistance was pointless. He was one person against an entire system designed to break people like him. "I'll cooperate," he said finally. "Good," Marcus said. "We leave at dawn. I suggest you rest and prepare yourself. This sale will determine your future. I recommend you make a good impression." They left, locking the cabin door from the outside. Daniel heard the key turn, heard their footsteps fade away, and then he was alone with the knowledge that in less than 12 hours he would be standing on an auction block. He sat on the edge of the bed, trembling. Not with fear exactly, but with a rage so intense it frightened him. He wanted to scream, to fight, to destroy something. But there was nothing to destroy except his few possessions, and no one to fight except the locked door. Instead, he did the only thing he could think of. He took out paper and began to write. He wrote for hours, documenting everything that had happened since his father's death, his arrival at Ashwood Hall, the conversation in Marcus's study, the confiscation of his documents, the entry in the plantation ledger, the trip to Charleston, the decision to sell him. He wrote in precise legal English, the kind of language that would be unmistakable in its meaning. He wrote, knowing the letter might never reach anyone, but also knowing he had to try, had to create some record that he existed as a person and not just as property. When he finished, he addressed it to the British consulate in Charleston. He didn't know if they would help, if they could help, if they even cared about a British subject being sold into slavery in South Carolina. But they were the only authority he could think of that might have jurisdiction, that might see him as something other than a commodity. He folded the letter carefully and hid it inside the cover of his father's Bible, the one book Marcus hadn't confiscated because he'd never thought to look for it. Then he lay down on the bed, still dressed, and stared at the ceiling. He thought about his father, who had died believing Marcus would honor his promise. He thought about his mother, who had left Charleston to escape exactly this kind of situation. He thought about how quickly everything he'd believed about himself, his identity, his freedom, could be stripped away. The next morning, the cabin was unlocked at dawn. One of the overseers, a man named Crawford, brought him water and told him to wash and dress carefully. They were leaving within the hour. Daniel washed. He dressed in the best clothes he had, a dark suit that his father had bought him in London 2 years ago. It was slightly worn now, carefully mended, but still respectable. Before they left, Thomas, the gardener who had been kind to him, approached carefully. "I heard what's happening," Thomas said quietly in the pre-dawn darkness. "I'm sorry." Daniel looked at this man who had shown him kindness for no reason except basic human decency. "Will you do something for me?" Daniel asked, keeping his voice low. "If I can." Daniel retrieved the letter from his cabin and pressed it into Thomas's hands. "After the auction. Not before, after. Take this to the British consulate on Meeting Street. Give it to anyone there and tell them it's urgent. Can you do that?" Thomas looked at the letter, then at Daniel. "You think it will help?" "I don't know," Daniel admitted. "Probably not. But I have to try something." Thomas nodded and tucked the letter inside his shirt. "I'll do it. Tomorrow morning." "Why are you helping me?" Daniel asked. Thomas smiled, but it was a sad smile, full of understanding that went beyond words. "Because maybe someday someone will help me, and even if they don't, at least I'll know I tried to be decent when I had the chance." They arrived at Ryan's Mart at 9 in the morning. The building was located on Chalmers Street, a large brick structure with a courtyard in the center. The courtyard was where the auctions were held, under a covered arcade that protected buyers from sun and rain while leaving the auction block itself exposed. By 9:30, the courtyard was already crowded. Charleston's elite came to these auctions like they attended theater performances or social gatherings. It was entertainment. It was business. It was a display of wealth and taste. Daniel was taken to a holding room on the ground floor. The room was bare except for benches along the walls. 6 other people were there, all of them scheduled for sale that morning. A young woman with a baby, 2 men who looked like field workers, a teenager who kept his eyes on the floor. They all stared at Daniel when he entered. He looked so different from them, so clearly out of place that they didn't even know how to categorize him. Daniel sat on a bench and waited. He could hear the auction beginning in the courtyard. The auctioneer's voice, rhythmic and practiced, the murmur of the crowd, the occasional burst of applause when a particularly high bid was accepted. At 10:30, Crawford came to get him. "You're next," he said. "Remember what Colonel Ashwood said. Cooperate. Present yourself well." Daniel stood. His legs felt unsteady, but he forced them to move. He followed Crawford through a door, down a short corridor, and then out into the bright morning sunlight of the courtyard. The crowd was larger than he'd expected, perhaps 200 people, men in fine suits, women in elaborate dresses, slave traders with calculating eyes, curious onlookers who came to these events for the spectacle. The auction block was a raised wooden platform in the center of the courtyard, simple, functional, stained dark from years of use. The auctioneer, a professional named Henry Ryan, who owned the establishment, stood at a podium beside the block. He was a man in his 50s with a commanding presence and a voice that carried across the courtyard without effort. When Daniel emerged from the corridor, the effect on the crowd was instant and electric. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Women turned and stared openly. Men leaned forward, assessing, The energy in the courtyard shifted, became charged with something Daniel couldn't quite name, but recognized instinctually as dangerous. Ryan himself paused in his preparation when he saw Daniel. His professional composure flickered, just for a moment, before returning. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ryan said, his voice cutting through the sudden silence, "we have before us an offering of truly exceptional quality, the property of Colonel Marcus Ashwood of Ashwood Hall." Daniel was led to the platform by Crawford. He walked steadily, keeping his face carefully neutral, showing nothing of what he felt. When he reached the center of the wooden platform, he stood perfectly still, his hands at his sides, his eyes focused on some distant point beyond the crowd. The morning sunlight caught his features, made his amber eyes luminous, emphasized the aristocratic perfection of his face. In that moment, Daniel understood exactly what he looked like to these people, not a person, not even really property in the conventional sense, but something rare and valuable, like a painting or a jewel or an exotic animal. Ryan began the description, his voice practiced and smooth. Age 21 years. British educated, fluent in English, French, Italian and Latin, literate in all languages, experienced in secretarial work, correspondence, bookkeeping, of exceptional temperament and appearance, suitable for only the finest households. Health certified excellent, minimum bid set at $3,000. The bidding started immediately. A man in the front row raised his hand. $3,500. Before Ryan could acknowledge it, someone else called out, $4,000. Then $4,500. The crowd was energized now, feeding off its own momentum. This wasn't just a purchase, it was a competition. It was a public display of wealth and status. To own Daniel would be to own something remarkable, something that elevated the buyer simply by association. $5,000. A woman's voice rang out. Eleanor Hayes, the wealthy widow Daniel had seen at the Whitmore house. $5,500, counted a merchant named Patrick Grimsley. Marcus stood to the side of the courtyard, watching the bidding escalate, and felt vindicated. He'd been right. Daniel was extraordinarily valuable, and this sale would be remembered for years. The bidding continued. $6,000, $6,500, $7,000. With each increase, the crowd grew more animated, more invested. This was theater, spectacle, a public performance of power. At $8,000, most of the bidders dropped out. At $9,000, only Eleanor Hayes and a Charleston banker named Rutledge remained. $9,500, Hayes said firmly. $10,000, Rutledge countered immediately. The crowd gasped. $10,000 for a single slave was almost unheard of, but the bidding wasn't finished. $10,500, Hayes said, her voice steady but her face flushed. $11,000. Rutledge responded without hesitation. $12,000, Hayes said, and her voice cut through the courtyard like a blade. Complete silence followed. $12,000 was insane. It was more than most people earned in 5 years of labor. It was more than some plantations were worth. Ryan looked at Rutledge. "Sir, do you counter?" Rutledge hesitated. He had money, significant money, but $12,000 for one slave, no matter how extraordinary, was madness. Before he could answer, Daniel spoke. 4 words in clear, precise English that carried across the silent courtyard. "I am a British subject." The effect was instantaneous. Several people gasped audibly. Others looked confused. Had they heard correctly? Had a slave just spoken from the auction block? Marcus's face went white, then flushed dark red. Crawford moved toward the platform, but Ryan held up his hand, stopping him. The auctioneer looked genuinely uncertain for the first time in his career. "Silence," Ryan said sharply. "You are not permitted to speak." Daniel turned his amber eyes directly on the auctioneer. When he spoke again, his voice was clearer, stronger, carrying perfect British pronunciation across the hushed courtyard. "My name is Daniel Ashwood. I am a British subject, born in London in 1829. I am the son of Robert Ashwood and the nephew of Colonel Marcus Ashwood. I arrived in Charleston 6 weeks ago at my father's request following his death. Upon my arrival, Colonel Ashwood confiscated my legal documentation and fraudulently entered me into his plantation records as a slave. I was born free. I have lived free my entire life. Under British law, I cannot be legally enslaved. This sale is fraudulent, and everyone participating in it is complicit in an illegal act. The silence that followed was absolute. For perhaps 5 seconds no one moved, no one breathed. The courtyard might have been frozen in time. Then chaos erupted. Marcus lunged toward the platform, shouting that Daniel was delusional, that he was the son of a mixed-race woman and had been educated as an indulgence but remained legally enslaved. Ryan stepped back from the podium, clearly calculating his own liability. Several men in the crowd began arguing loudly, some insisting the sale should be stopped immediately, others maintaining that a slave's testimony was worthless. Eleanor Hayes had gone very pale and was speaking urgently to a man beside her who appeared to be her lawyer. In the middle of this chaos, something remarkable happened. A tall man in formal clothing pushed through the crowd to the platform. He identified himself in a crisp British accent as James Whitfield, representative of the British consulate in Charleston. His voice cut through the noise. The British consulate has received documentation regarding Mr. Daniel Ashwood. We can confirm his birth registration in London in 1829, his baptism at St. Martin in the Fields, and his status as a British subject. We have on file his birth certificate, educational records, and documentation of his arrival in Charleston. Under British law and international treaty, he cannot be legally enslaved. We demand that this sale be suspended immediately, pending full diplomatic review. The effect was explosive. Ryan looked at Marcus, then at Daniel, then at Whitfield. He was calculating rapidly. If Daniel was truly a British subject and this sale proceeded, everyone involved could face diplomatic consequences, potential legal action, international scandal. But if Daniel wasn't a British subject and the sale was stopped, Marcus and the bidders would have grounds for significant complaints. Marcus, recovering from his shock, produced papers from his jacket. "These are forgeries," he shouted. "This young man is the son of one of my slaves. He has been fed lies about his parentage. I have documentation proving his mother was enslaved at Ashwood Hall. I intended to sell him to a good family where he might be disabused of these delusions." He had prepared for this, Daniel realized. Marcus had known there was a chance Daniel might speak up, might claim freedom, and had prepared a counter-narrative. But Whitfield wasn't finished. He produced a document from his jacket. "We also have a letter," he said clearly, "written by Mr. Daniel Ashwood and delivered to our consulate this morning by a witness. It details the circumstances of his arrival in Charleston, the confiscation of his papers, and his fraudulent enslavement. The letter demonstrates knowledge of British society, British law, and British customs consistent with his claimed background. We have forwarded copies to the Governor of South Carolina and to Washington. This matter is now under official review at the highest levels." Marcus went absolutely still. A letter. How had Daniel managed to send a letter? But the implications were clear. If British diplomatic authorities were involved, if the governor's office was involved, the auction couldn't proceed regardless of Daniel's legal status. Even if Marcus was right and Daniel could be legally enslaved, doing so now while under international scrutiny would invite consequences that could destroy everything Marcus had built. Ryan made the only decision he could. He struck his gavel twice, the sharp sound cutting through the confused noise. "This auction is suspended pending legal and diplomatic review. The individual in question will be removed from the block and held in neutral custody until the matter is resolved. All bids are hereby voided. This sale will not proceed today." 2 Charleston constables, who had apparently accompanied Whitfield, stepped forward. They didn't shackle Daniel, which was significant. They weren't certain he was enslaved, which meant they had to treat him as potentially free. They simply escorted him off the platform and toward a side exit, away from the crowd. As Daniel passed Marcus, their eyes met. His uncle's expression was complicated, rage, certainly, but also something that might have been respect, or perhaps just recognition that he had underestimated his opponent. Daniel said nothing. There was nothing to say. Everything that needed to be said had been spoken in front of 200 witnesses in the courtyard of Ryan's Mart. Daniel was taken to a secure room in the Charleston City Hall, a building that housed both government offices and holding cells for complicated legal cases. The room was neither a cell nor a guest room, something carefully in between, reflecting his ambiguous status. He had a bed, a chair, a small table, a window with bars. He was locked in but not chained. He was guarded but not treated as a criminal. For 5 days, he waited while lawyers and diplomats and officials examined documents, took testimony, and tried to unravel the legal knot he and Marcus had created. During those 5 days, several things happened that would determine not just Daniel's fate, but the fate of everyone involved in what was already being called the Ryan's Mart incident. First, the British consulate confirmed that all of Daniel's documents were authentic. There was indeed a birth record in London for Daniel Ashwood, son of Robert Ashwood and Catherine Ashwood, registered as a legitimate birth. There were baptismal records, school records, letters of reference. Everything matched Daniel's claims. Second, Marcus produced his counter-evidence. 3 witnesses who swore they had known a slave named Catherine at Ashwood Hall in the 1822. She had been Uncle Thomas's property, they claimed, never freed despite what any will might have said. She had left Charleston in 1836 as a fugitive, and her son, if she'd had one, would have inherited her enslaved status. The witnesses were all white, all respectable, all willing to testify under oath. Their testimony was valuable under South Carolina law. More valuable, in fact, than Daniel's own claims about his mother. Third, and most significantly, the British consulate pushed back hard. They produced correspondence between Robert Ashwood and British banks spanning 20 years. They produced evidence of Catherine Ashwood working as a governess in Paris in the 1842, something an enslaved fugitive could never have done openly. They produced witnesses from London who remembered Daniel as a child, who could testify to his free upbringing. And they made it clear that if Daniel was sold into slavery, if his claims were dismissed, it would create a diplomatic incident that South Carolina could not afford. Britain was watching. Britain cared. And Britain had the power to make South Carolina's international trade very, very complicated. On March 22nd, Judge Harrison Pemberton, a man known for careful deliberation and a certain sympathy toward preserving South Carolina's relationship with British commerce, issued his ruling. It was a masterpiece of legal complexity that essentially resolved everything while satisfying no one. The ruling stated, Daniel Ashwood's legal status cannot be definitively determined from the available evidence within South Carolina's jurisdiction. The documentation suggests he was born free in London. The testimony suggests his mother may have been enslaved. Without the testimony of Catherine Ashwood herself, or without more substantial documentation proving her status at the time of Daniel's birth in London, no conclusive determination can be made under South Carolina law. However, the involvement of British diplomatic authorities and the existence of substantial documentation supporting Daniel Ashwood's claims of British citizenship create a legal situation that transcends state authority. Under international treaty obligations and in the interest of maintaining diplomatic relations, this court cannot permit the sale or continued detention of an individual who may be a British subject. Therefore, the attempted sale is declared void and fraudulent. Colonel Marcus Ashwood is prohibited from claiming Daniel Ashwood as property. Daniel Ashwood is hereby released from custody and declared free to leave South Carolina, with the strong recommendation that he do so immediately. However, this ruling should not be interpreted as a definitive determination of status under South Carolina law for any other individuals, nor should it be cited as precedent. This is a unique case involving international jurisdiction, and the resolution reflects diplomatic necessity rather than a judgment on the merits of enslavement law generally. It was a political ruling, not a legal one. It freed Daniel without actually establishing that he had been wrongly enslaved. It protected Marcus from criminal charges while prohibiting him from pursuing the matter further. It satisfied British diplomatic concerns while preserving South Carolina's legal framework intact. Everyone could claim some version of victory. No one was entirely satisfied. When Daniel walked out of Charleston City Hall on the afternoon of March 22nd, he carried only what he'd brought to Charleston: the clothes on his back, his father's Bible, and a letter from the British consulate stating they recognized him as a British subject and would provide passage back to England if he desired it. His documents, confiscated by Marcus 6 weeks earlier, had been returned to him that morning by a lawyer. No explanation, no apology, just a leather portfolio handed over with bureaucratic indifference. Daniel stood on the street outside City Hall and looked at Charleston around him, this strange, beautiful, terrible city, where he had been bought and sold and freed within the span of 8 days, where he had learned exactly how fragile freedom actually was. He had nowhere to go. He knew no one except Marcus, and returning to Ashwood Hall was impossible. He had approximately $15 that the British consulate had advanced him. Enough for a few nights' lodging and meals, but not enough for passage anywhere. But he was free, legally, officially, documentedly free, and that was something. What happened next is where history becomes murky, where documentation thins and story takes over. Some accounts say Daniel left Charleston that very day, booking passage on a merchant ship to Boston within hours of his release. Others say he remained in the city for several weeks, quietly working as a tutor under his real name, rebuilding enough money to leave properly. A notice appeared in a Boston newspaper in May 1850 advertising the services of D. Ashwood, British-educated tutor, specializing in classical languages and European literature. It may have been him. It may have been coincidence. A letter arrived at the British consulate in Charleston in August 1850, signed only as D.A., thanking them for their intervention and stating that the writer was well, free, and beginning again in a place where his appearance attracted no particular attention. Thomas, the gardener from Ashwood Hall, told other enslaved workers that he saw Daniel 3 days after the auction, walking on the Charleston waterfront at dawn, dressed in simple working clothes and carrying a small bag. Thomas said he called out to him and Daniel turned, smiled, put a finger to his lips, and kept walking toward where the northern ships docked. Whether this actually happened or was a story Thomas created because people needed to believe Daniel escaped cleanly, no one can definitively say. What is documented is this. Marcus Ashwood never fully recovered from the scandal. His business continued. Ashwood Hall remained profitable, but his standing in Charleston society was permanently damaged. Several families quietly severed social connections. The story of the auction spread through drawing rooms and private correspondence. Marcus Ashwood, they whispered, had tried to sell his own nephew, had stolen a free man's papers and enslaved him, had stood by while the young man was humiliated on an auction block. Whether Daniel had been legally enslavable or not almost didn't matter. What mattered was that Marcus had violated fundamental codes about family, about honor, about the proper way a gentleman conducted himself. In Charleston's rigid social hierarchy, that kind of violation could never be fully forgiven. In 1856, Marcus received a package with no return address. Inside was a book, a British edition of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. On the title page, someone had written in elegant script, "We are so very humble, Uriah Heep." It was a quote from the novel. It was also a message. Marcus recognized the handwriting as Daniel's. He burned the book that same day. But not before his daughter Elizabeth saw it and wrote about it in her diary. That diary survived. The reference was pointed. Uriah Heep was a character who pretended to be humble while secretly plotting against those who had power over him, a character who ultimately destroyed the man who had controlled him. Whether Daniel was threatening revenge or simply noting an ironic parallel, Marcus took it as a threat. He hired private investigators to locate Daniel. They found nothing. He increased security at Ashwood Hall. He began sleeping with a loaded pistol in his bedside table. And he began to decline, physically and mentally, much faster than his age alone could explain. Marcus died in 1861, at the age of 63, just as the Civil War was beginning to tear apart the world he'd spent his life building. His doctor called it heart failure, brought on by nervous exhaustion. The enslaved people who attended him in his final weeks reported that he spoke frequently to someone who wasn't there, someone he called the boy. He said repeatedly, "I gave you shelter. I was protecting you. Why can't you understand that?" No one knew who he was talking to. Ryan's Mart continued to hold auctions for another 11 years, until Sherman's march through South Carolina in 1865 destroyed much of Charleston's infrastructure and ended the slave trade forever. But the auction of March 17th, 1850, was never mentioned in the establishment's official records or advertisements after that day. The documentation, all of it, the bills of attempted sale, the bidder agreements, the records of the suspension, disappeared from Ryan's files. It was as if the entire event had been collectively erased. Except it wasn't. The story persisted, told and retold in Charleston households, mentioned in private letters, occasionally surfacing in legal discussions about status determination and the rights of people with complicated ancestry. It became a legend. The beautiful slave who declared himself British and vanished. For those of you interested in stories like this, stories about the people who refused to disappear quietly, stories about the systems that tried to erase them, this is exactly what the Sealed Room explores. The uncomfortable truths, the buried histories, the moments when individuals stood up against institutions designed to crush them. Now, here's what makes Daniel's story genuinely fascinating and genuinely disturbing. Daniel was almost certainly telling the truth about everything. The British consulate's confirmation was real. The London records were legitimate. Robert's marriage was documented. His education was verified. And Marcus's counter-evidence, the witnesses who claimed to remember a slave named Catherine at Ashwood Hall, doesn't appear in any documentation before Daniel's arrival. There's no inventory listing her, no purchase record, no other children she might have had, no sale record when she supposedly fled, nothing. She appears only in Marcus's testimony and the testimony of his witnesses. But nowhere in the extensive paper trail that usually accompanied enslaved people in South Carolina, which suggests something darker than the story initially implies, that Marcus didn't just enslave a free man through legal manipulation, he also fabricated evidence, coached witnesses, constructed an entire false history to justify his actions. If that's true, then what happened at Ryan's Mart wasn't just an auction gone wrong. It was the exposure of a carefully planned fraud. A fraud that would have succeeded completely if Daniel hadn't found the courage to speak up in that courtyard. And if that's true, Daniel's disappearance makes even more sense. He wasn't just running from slavery. He was running from someone who had proven willing to destroy his entire identity, to falsify evidence, to commit fraud on a massive scale, all to transform an inconvenient nephew into valuable property. The last documented reference to Daniel Ashwood comes from 1893, 43 years after the auction. A researcher named William Crawford was interviewing elderly Charlestonians for a book on the city's history. One man, Thomas Jefferson Brown, then 87, told him about an auction he'd witnessed as a young man. The most beautiful young man he'd ever seen, standing on the auction block at Ryan's Mart, declaring himself British while the crowd watched in shock. Crawford asked if Brown thought the young man had really been free. "Oh, absolutely," Brown said. "You could see it in everything about him. The way he stood, the way he spoke, The way he looked those people in the eye. Free people carry themselves differently. That young man was free. He just had to prove it to people who didn't want to believe it. Crawford asked if Brown thought Daniel survived if he escaped to the north or back to England. Brown smiled. I think he went somewhere he could breathe, somewhere his face didn't mean anything except that he was himself. Maybe Boston, maybe London, maybe Canada. Somewhere far from Charleston and everything it represented. And I think he lived a long life and never told anyone what happened to him, because some things are too painful to relive. You carry them with you until you die, and then they die with you. Whether he was right, we'll never know. But the fact that South Carolina sealed certain records related to the case in 1851, and those records remain sealed to this day, suggests that someone, somewhere, thought the full truth was too dangerous to make public. Those records remain classified. Several historians have petitioned for access over the past 170 years. Every petition has been denied. The official reason is always the same: privacy concerns regarding status determinations and family lineage of potentially living descendants. But Daniel would have been born in 1829. Anyone who could be his direct descendant would now be several generations removed. Privacy concerns typically don't extend that far, which suggests the real reason the records remain sealed is different. Maybe they contain proof that Marcus committed fraud, suborned perjury, and engaged in systematic document falsification. Maybe they reveal complicity by other prominent families who knew what Marcus was doing and said nothing. Maybe they document other similar cases, other people who were fraudulently enslaved and never freed. Or maybe the records contain evidence of where Daniel went, what name he used, where he settled, how he lived the rest of his life. Maybe somewhere in those sealed documents is the answer everyone wants to know. Did he make it? Did he really escape? Did he build a new life somewhere, becoming someone else entirely? The evidence we have suggests he did. The letter to the consulate in 1850, the book sent to Marcus in 1856, the complete absence of any record of Daniel being recaptured or re-enslaved, the silence where there should have been noise if Marcus had found him. All of it points toward escape, survival, reinvention. Maybe Thomas Brown was right. Maybe Daniel went somewhere he could breathe, Montreal or London or Boston or New York, and simply started over. Maybe he became a tutor or a translator or a clerk or anything else that would allow him to use his education while avoiding scrutiny. Maybe he married, had children, grew old, and died without ever telling anyone about the 8 days in March 1850 when he'd been neither fully enslaved nor fully free, when his entire existence had hung in balance while strangers debated his humanity. If that's true, then somewhere in the records of Montreal or London or Boston or New York, there might be a death certificate for a man with a British name, born around 1829, occupation listed as teacher or clerk, with no other notable details. And if someone found that certificate and traced it back, they might discover it belonged to Daniel Ashwood, who was sold in Charleston and declared himself free and then vanished into history. But maybe that's not the right question. Maybe the question isn't whether Daniel escaped or where he went or what happened to him afterward. Maybe the question is why we need to know. Why this story, out of thousands of similar stories from that era, has persisted. Why people still search for Daniel Ashwood in old records and census documents and shipping manifests. I think it's because his story does something rare. It shows someone refusing to disappear. Most people in his situation simply vanished from history, swallowed by a system designed to erase them. Their names were changed, their identities were stripped, their stories were lost. But Daniel didn't vanish silently. He stood on that auction block and said his own name. He claimed his identity in front of 200 witnesses. He forced the system to acknowledge him, even if it couldn't quite figure out how to categorize him. And then, yes, he disappeared. But he disappeared on his own terms, after making absolutely certain that everyone knew exactly who he was. That's not erasure, that's transformation. That's choosing to become invisible rather than being forced into invisibility. There's a profound difference. This story shows us something important about identity, freedom, and the terrible fragility of both. In a world where your status as a human being could be determined by ancestry, by the color of your skin, by the cruelty or kindness of your relatives, Daniel Ashwood should never have been on that auction block. Whether he was legally enslavable under South Carolina law or not, the fact that his fate could be debated at all, that his humanity was considered a legal question requiring adjudication and diplomatic intervention, tells us everything we need to know about the system that put him there. But it also shows us something about resistance, about refusing to accept other people's definitions of who you are, about the power of simply saying your own name when everyone else wants to rename you, redefine you, reduce you to property. Daniel stood on that wooden platform and said, "I am a British subject," knowing it might destroy him, knowing it might lead to even worse consequences than silent compliance. And whether or not those words changed his immediate circumstances, they changed the story. They transformed him from a passive victim into an active participant in his own fate. And maybe that's why we're still telling this story 175 years later. Because in the end, Daniel won. Not in court, not in any complete legal sense, but in the only way that really matters. He refused to be forgotten. He made sure that anyone who tried to erase him would have to work very hard to do it. And he left enough traces, the letter, the book, the testimony, the sealed records, that we can still find him if we look. So what do you think? Do you believe Daniel was telling the truth about his birth? Do you think Marcus fabricated evidence, or did he genuinely believe Catherine had been enslaved? Do you think Daniel escaped cleanly, or is there more to the story that we don't know? And why would South Carolina keep those records sealed for 175 years if there wasn't something explosive in them? Something that still matters even now? Leave your comment below. Tell me what you think happened to Daniel Ashwood. Tell me if you think the sealed records should be opened. Tell me if you've ever heard family stories about similar cases, about people who fell through the cracks of history, about truths that were buried because they were too uncomfortable to acknowledge. And if you enjoyed this story, if you want to hear more about the people they tried to erase, the secrets they tried to bury, the uncomfortable truths they sealed away in archives and courthouses and family Bibles, then subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who loves historical mysteries, who cares about the stories that powerful people wanted forgotten. Because every view, every share, every comment helps bring these buried voices back to life. And maybe, somewhere in some sealed record or dusty archive, the full truth about Daniel Ashwood is still waiting to be found. Maybe someone watching this video right now has an ancestor who knew him, who helped him, who heard his story and kept it alive in whispered conversations and private letters. Maybe the truth isn't lost. Maybe it's just waiting for the right person to look in the right place. See you in the next story.